Objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome our witnesses, members, and our guests in the audience to today's hearing. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on a hearing entitled, "How Many Wolves Are Enough? Examining the Need to Delist the Gray Wolf." By way of introduction, I'm Cliff Bentz, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries. I also represent the 2nd District of Oregon, a district far bigger than the state of, oh wait, let's keep on moving. I'm sorry, far bigger than all states east of the Mississippi. But I digress. I'm grateful to be joined today by 5 of my colleagues. I ask unanimous consent that the gentlewoman from Minnesota, and the gentleman from other states, Mr. Stauber and Ms. Fishbach, gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, as well as the gentlewoman from Utah, Ms. Malloy, be allowed to participate in today's hearing without objection so ordered. Since this is a congressional hearing, we are going to begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I now recognize a group of students from the Harvest Christian School in Sandstone, Minnesota to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So before I get my opening statement, I want to explain how we ended up here today. Some months ago, some wolves in Oregon attacked a group of about 300 heifers, younger mother cows, in the southern part of my state, ran them through fences that enclosed them and ran them literally dozens, if not hundreds of miles in through the forest and scattered them widely. This was just one event among many that are occurring in Oregon. So it seemed to me, and I spoke with the committee staff about this, and everybody agreed we needed to have a hearing on the wolf. We then just debated where to have the hearing. Fortunately, in Oregon, we don't have as many wolves as you guys do here. You guys have thousands, we have hundreds. And so it seemed to me that the proper place to hold the hearing was a place just like this, where people and wolves are forced to cohabitate, and the numbers are in the thousands. Because, of course, the value of this hearing is going to be on its messaging ability. And that's why I'm happy that people are watching back in Oregon online as I speak. And I'm happy that we'll have this opportunity to raise the challenge that wolf presents nationwide in today's hearing. We are joined today, and I want to have each one of the members up here not give a lengthy speech. We don't have time for that, but to at least explain where they're from and who they are. We'll start here with Congresswoman Fishbach.
I'm Michelle Fishbach, and I represent the western half of Minnesota. So I border Canada, North Dakota, South Dakota, and I am happy to be here today because obviously we share this issue in the western part of the state also. Thank you.
Harriet Hageman and I represent the state of Wyoming. My involvement with the wolves was representing a variety of organizations over a 15-year period in Wyoming from 2002 until 2017, when we were finally successful at delisting the gray wolf in Wyoming through a variety of lawsuits. So I've been fighting this battle for well over 2 decades.
And I'm Congressman Stauber, representing this great 8th District of Minnesota, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Congressman Tom Tiffany. I'm straight east of here in Wisconsin. I cover the northern part of Wisconsin in the 7th Congressional District. Great issue for us to be hearing, and I see a few Wisconsinites here. Good to see people from throughout the upper Midwest joining us for this, Mr. Chairman.
Celeste Malloy, I represent the 2nd District in Utah. I'm also the newest member of Congress, but my background's in agriculture. I have my FFA bracelet on, and I've spent my career working in natural resources policy, natural resources management, so I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. So I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Notwithstanding Teddy Roosevelt's statement that quote, the wolf is a beast of waste and destruction, end quote. The wolf is here to stay. So this hearing is not about eradicating the gray wolf. But the wolf is not going to be reintroduced in every place where it used to be, such as Manhattan Island, Southern California, Denver, Seattle, Baltimore, for example. Why? Because those areas are now filled with people, and there is no longer habitat or prey for the wolf, and of course, no one wants to put their children at risk, as is the case, as we heard this morning, in Minnesota. So the burden of returning the nature to, quote, balance, end quote, will not fall on those living in the hills of L.A. or in the concrete canyons of New York. Instead, the costs and the risks of harboring an apex predator will fall upon those of us who live in rural America. But this does not mean that we who live in rural areas must silently accept the urban imposition of this very real cost of the wolf. No, we do not have to accept this any more than the law requires. What I'm saying is we do not have to accept any more wolves than the absolute minimum necessary to meet the requirements of the Endangered Species Act. And we need to be able to control the population of wolves so that minimum number is not exceeded. To do this, we must know how many wolves the ESA requires. And in my mind, the answer is enough to maintain its survival as a species and no more. Secondly, we must have the wolf removed from the ESA's list of endangered creatures. Why? Because if they are on the list, their numbers cannot be controlled. I'm extremely happy to mention that just 2 days ago, the bill to remove the wolf from the endangered species list passed across the floor of the House and is on its way to the Senate. Given that U.S. Fish and Given that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has found that the wolf is no longer endangered, the only surprise in the process of passing the bill was the number of Democrats voting against it. 201 Democrats, all but 4 brave souls, voted to keep the wolf listed. Just 4 out of 205 Democrats voted to delist. This is amazing because unless the wolf is delisted, rural Americans cannot legally act to protect their communities, wildlife, children, and livestock from the horror of being attacked and torn apart by a wolf. Why anyone would vote for a continued needless destruction of vast numbers of deer, elk, and moose, not to mention the livelihoods of hundreds of farmers and ranchers, is beyond me. As we will hear from witnesses today, unmanaged wolf populations have a devastating impact on farmers and ranchers and other wildlife species and the communities that depend upon them. The fact is that wolves are apex predators who rely on killing other animals to survive, whether they are a farmer's cattle or wild moose living out of the forests of Minnesota. The management of wolf populations is the only logical path forward that can strike a balance between maintaining a healthy population and protecting the way of life of so many of our constituents. The good news is that states have already proven to be capable wildlife managers. States, not the federal government. This was confirmed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service 2 months ago when they denied petitions to list gray wolves in the western United States and relist them in the northern Rockies ecosystem, an area where wolves have been delisted for over 10 years. The service stated that wolves, quote, are not at risk of extinction in the western United States now or in the foreseeable future, end quote. The service also stated that wolves in the western United States have a healthy abundance, retain genetic diversity, and the ability to respond to high mortality events and maintain adaptive capacity. Instead of sitting on our hands and allowing the issues associated with an unmanaged wolf population to grow, we as members of Congress must continue to act to ensure the voices of our constituents are heard and that we do everything we can to delist the gray wolf. The action on the House floor this week was one step in the right direction, and I believe this hearing today will continue that path forward. I now recognize Mr. Stauber for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for coming to Minnesota's 8th Congressional District and convening this field hearing. As we will learn this morning, the growing wolf population and the inability to properly manage the species due largely to its listing status under the Endangered Species Act is affecting our way of life here in Minnesota. It is an incredibly important issue facing my constituents, and I really appreciate the attention you and the entire subcommittee are giving to it. I also want to thank all my colleagues for traveling here to Minnesota and joining us today. You all come from very different districts around the country and thus provide important perspectives on the wolf management. Over the past several months, I have traveled across my district to hold listening sessions and attend grassroots assemblies focused on the impact of Minnesota's growing wolf population, like those organized by the Hunters for Hunters organization that has been at the forefront of this issue and really making a big difference. What I've heard from my constituents is clear. The gray wolf has been recovered, but that's not just something we're hearing anecdotally. We have the data and the science to back it up. When the gray wolf was listed as threatened in Minnesota under the Endangered Species Act in 1978, a recovery goal of 1,250 to 1,400 wolves was set. Today, according to data from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, we have over 2,700 wolves in Minnesota. That's about half of the total wolves in the entire lower 48. By official estimates, half of the wolves in this country are here in Minnesota, and their population is twice as high as our wildlife manager's goal set at the species listing. That said, as I have traveled across the district, it's clear that this 2,700 wolf count number is an undercount. There are likely hundreds, if not thousands, more. We should celebrate that. The gray wolf is a success story of the ESA. Species were never meant to be listed under the ESA indefinitely, but that's the reality today. Since the ESA's enactment over 5 decades ago, only 2 to 3% of species ever listed have made it off the list. The ESA has been weaponized by radical activist groups that don't want to follow the science that proves the gray wolf has recovered and should be delisted. And that's not just an opinion from myself and my colleagues on this panel hold. It's something that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has agreed with under multiple administrations. The Obama, Trump, and Biden administration have all agreed and have all taken steps to delist the gray wolf. But each of these efforts have been blocked by activist judges in cases brought by activist groups. Earlier this week, as mentioned earlier, the House of Representatives passed the Trust the Science Act, a bill that I was proud to help lead, that directs the Fish and Wildlife Service to reinstate the 2020 delisting rule. This passed with bipartisan support. It now heads to the Senate, where it will be up to our U.S. senators to act. And I call on both Senators Klobuchar and Smith to follow the science and push for a vote on this legislation on the Senate floor. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses this morning who will share just how important this legislation and proper wolf management is to communities across Minnesota and the entire United States. Before I yield, I do want to acknowledge 2 witnesses that were invited to testify but declined the subcommittee's invitation. Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Sarah Strawman, was invited to testify, but she refused to do so. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was also invited to testify. They too declined our invitation. I think their absence, unfortunately, speaks volumes. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for coming to the great state of Minnesota and convening this hearing, and I look forward to our conversations, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stauber. The one thing before I introduce our witnesses, I would like everyone to recognize, we'll do it in just a second, the Wildlife and Fisheries Subcommittee, of which I chair, staff for all of their hard work putting this together. Can you give them a round of applause, please? Thank you. I'll now introduce our witnesses. Senator Steve Green of Minnesota Senate from Fosston, Minnesota. Representative Nathan Nelson of the Minnesota House of Representatives from Hinckley, Minnesota. And I want to thank you for the tour you gave us of your farm this morning, and it was superb, and thank you so much for taking that time and effort. Dr. Nathan Roberts, Associate Professor for Conservation and Wildlife Management from the College of Ozarks, Point Lookout, Missouri. Mr. John Williams, Co-Chair of the Wolf Committee with the Oregon Cattlemen's Association in Enterprise, Oregon. Mr. Jim Hamill, President of Iron Range Consulting and Services in Crystal Falls, Michigan. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow. And at the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red. And I'll ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow all witnesses to testify before member questioning. I now recognize Senator Green. Senator, you're recognized for 5 minutes. And we understand you have to leave almost immediately to go back and vote. So don't be surprised, everyone, if he gives a statement and then runs out the door.
Yeah, I'm not abandoning you, but
Thank
Chairman Bentz and committee members, I want to thank you so much for coming here. This is a big issue for us. Most of my statement was already testified by our good congressman, so that will make mine a little shorter. But I will say that I've been working on this issue since I was elected in 2013. It's not a new issue for us. And the devastation of the wolves in my district and to the east and north, this goes back as far as I can remember into the 70s, where our livestock producers were losing their calves, and even at that time too, having problems with the government agencies trying to get them under control. And in 2013, the same number that you're looking at now, this 2,700, is what the agency was claiming. We didn't believe it then. We were having higher numbers given to us then, and now when we see how much the population has grown again, and I want to thank these people behind me for being here, because they're a big part of how this came into the open. The Hunters for Hunters and the people that have got their video cameras up, their game cameras up, have shown us that the wolves are everywhere and the deer are disappearing. And it's noticeably now. And so I really appreciate the fact that this is coming to light. And as this, first of all, the wolves, we know they'll go after the easiest prey. And right now our deer population is down, and now they're coming more and more after the cattle. And as their food source declines, now we're seeing them coming after our domestic animals. And what is next? We fear for our children out here. And the wolves are no longer afraid of us. I mean, you can drive right by them on the road and they'll stand right there. So there's no fear of humans. The other issue that I want to talk about before my time runs out is the issue with the indigenous people and the wolf being sacred. Now, I don't deny that there's some people that do hold that, but the vast majority of us do not. And I remember the White Earth Nation. We rely a great deal on deer and other game animals for our food source. And if you talk to certain people that like to talk on the news, they'll tell you a different story. But if you get down and you talk to the people that don't want to be on the news, that I don't want to say fear the camera, but have no desire to be in front of a camera or have their face out there, they'll tell you a completely different story. That this is very important to them. And the deer population for us, and also the smaller game population, is very, very important. And so you won't hear the same things if you're out talking to regular people that you do talking to those that are constantly in the news. And I hope you take that into account. Most of the rest of my testimony has already been said here, and so I'm not going to continue down that path. I do want to thank you, because part of my testimony was to ask you to move your bills forward apart from the Fish and Wildlife, and to get these bills through Congress, that we can deal with the issues we have in Minnesota. And we still will have a fight in Minnesota, but you will ease a lot of our concerns by getting these bills through. So I appreciate that very much, and thank you for hearing me out.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Nelson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for this opportunity to testify. And for those that were able to come out to the farm this morning and tour it and just see firsthand where our farm has experienced livestock depredation, thank you for that and being able to share my story. And my story is much the same of many of the farms in our area. And there's times that we can find the results of the loss, and we're able to turn in a claim. And that's it's a hard thing to deal with, but we're thankful that there are claims available, and that is there. And one of the things that's important is to continue to be able to have these funds available for when we do have the loss. Our farm, it was in the early 1990s. There was wolves reintroduced in our area, and it was shortly thereafter we started seeing the behavior of our livestock change. And it wasn't much longer after that we started experiencing loss. And unfortunately, one of the things with loss, if you can't find any remains of an animal, of our livestock, we're not able to file a claim to do anything with that. And so it wasn't really until the early 2000s that we had actually had a claim that was payable, and to really be able to investigate. And since then, we've lost somewhere around 40 animals, calves and cows both, on our farm. Many of them we've lost. We can't account for them, but I am quite confident that they have been lost to wolf depredation. And my neighbors are much the same stories. And while this is much of my testimony is going to be about livestock, one of the things in our area is if you've driven in here, you know, there's a lot of forested area. It's a great area for recreation, and I think one of the things that have really brought this story to the highlight has been the sportsmen that have really gotten on board. They've been sharing their pictures from their game camera. They've been sharing their stories of the declining deer population, and yes, there may be several factors to that, but I believe that wolves are a big part of that story. When the wolves are delisted or have been listed, they've been gone back and forth on being delisted by several different methods, but most of it is agency action. And on the endangered species list, unfortunately, it feels like it's the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. This is the story of the wolves is something that should be celebrated. The recovery has happened. I believe there is a sustainable population, and now we are to a point where I truly believe that we need to have management of a species. When there's a natural resources, all of it must be managed properly, whether it's our forestry, iron, whatever, wildlife, all of it. And the timber wolves are one of those, the gray wolf. And as the management changes, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to increase the number to be able to go out in the wilderness and see them. I rarely see a wolf on my farm, maybe 5 or 6 times a year, and I'm outside a lot, and I live in the heart of gray wolf territory. And it's rare to see them. But at the same time, we're not going to be able to just, like a zoo, be able to go out and see these animals. But yet they are a part of our ecosystem, and they do need to be managed. I thank you for this, being here today and be able to hear this story. I've got countless stories of constituents of mine as a state representative that have reached out to me and shared their stories, their heartbreaking loss. The wolves coming in right up around their house, taking their pets. It is an issue that is continuing to grow. And I think without further action, they are going to become more and more brazen, and there will be more and more conflict. And I truly believe that we do need to have management, and that we celebrate the success of the endangered species plan and the act or what has taken place, and be able to remove them and move to management. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Nelson. I now recognize Dr. Roberts for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bentz, and thank you, committee members, for the opportunity to be here today to speak about wolf recovery. A year ago, I testified that the gray wolf is recovered and should be removed from the Endangered Species Act. I still stand by that statement today. The wolf is recovered in the United States. The established recovery plan for the Great Lakes region set clear numeric goals to serve as criteria for determining successful recovery. Those criteria have been exceeded every year since at least 1994, with an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 individuals in this region alone. Again, I note that every wolf on the landscape in the Great Lakes region today was born long after recovery goals were met. Some argue that states will eradicate wolves if state management authority is returned. Some jurisdictions may continue state or tribal level protections, while others may allow for some regulated take. While states may vary on how large the population should be, they all plan for and set policies to have sustainable and secure populations. Some states would likely reduce populations to achieve management goals, but no states are suggesting they desire to remove wolves altogether. In fact, all states with wolves have a stated goal of maintaining a population that ensures a long-term viability of wolves. It is critical to recognize there is a fundamental difference between desiring no wolves at all versus scientifically and responsibly managing wolves to establish population goals, which in some cases may mean less wolves. Many states, based on their respective wolf management plans, may have the need to have fewer wolves in current numbers, but that does not mean they desire to eradicate the species. Some argue the number of wolves taken in recent years in areas or times when wolves are not listed is alarming. Hunting of any species causes short-term decline in the population as individuals are removed. The actual number of animals removed is not the important metric to consider. Rather, the population trajectory viewed on an annual basis is more informative when considering the long-term viability of a population. In other words, what we really want to know is the population increasing, decreasing, or remaining stable from year to year? Jurisdictions use a variety of techniques and methods to estimate population trajectory of wolves. State fish and wildlife agencies have successfully managed countless species this way over the past century, from waterfowl to upland birds, deer, and elk. Monitoring programs allow for evaluating population responses to management actions and changes. These methods are well established and supported by peer-reviewed literature. We could be confident the wolf population is at least as large as estimates suggest because jurisdictions are using scientifically sound methods to produce these estimates. Similarly, we could be confident that the potential impacts of management actions can be evaluated and adapted as needed. Wolves are resilient. Peer-reviewed scientific information can give us insight as to what level of take is sustainable. Published scientific work has found that take rates up to 29% resulted in no decrease in annual population trajectory. The distribution of wolves further contributes to this resiliency, as wolves are represented by several metapopulations that collectively compose the overall population. In the unlikely event that a metapopulation were to experience severe population declines, these could be mitigated by the other subpopulations. The Department of Interior appropriately recognizes resiliency in their final rule published in 2020. Some have concern that wolves are not found throughout their historic range. Wolves are restored in the Great Lakes and Rocky Mountain regions. However, it is true they're not found throughout their complete historic range. This does not mean the species is threatened. There are enough wolves in these established populations to ensure that wolves will remain in the United States. Most species are not found throughout their historic range. Elk and black bear, for example, are still absent from much of their historic range. However, elk and bears, like wolves, are still secure. States can restore native species in the absence of ESA protections. There are active programs in several states to restore elk and ruffed grouse, even though these species are not federally listed. Failing to recognize that wolves are recovered undermines the intention of the ESA. The Act was intended to provide temporary protection and funding until a species met established recovery goals, at which time states are to regain management authority through delisting. Gray wolves are recovered in the United States. The science is clear, the species is recovered, secure, and recovery goals have been met many times over. States have the ability and an undeniable track record of species management and recovery to manage the species effectively and sustainably for the benefit of the public they serve. Wolves are restored. Now it's time to restore management to the states. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. I now recognize Mr. John Williams for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and representatives. With wolves expanding to many areas of Oregon, livestock producers need relief from the economic devastation and the emotional stress they're enduring as wolves impact nearly every aspect of their operation. We need to be able to have the ability to protect ourselves, our families, and our private property, including our livestock, from wolves. Ranchers are at risk of losing their ranches, their way of life, their homes, and their income. The production losses due to the presence of wolves, which is much larger than the dead and injured animals, all lead to a significant emotional stress to the ranching community. To be able to do this, wolves must be removed from the Endangered Species Act. In Oregon, the wolf was removed from the Oregon ESA in 2015 because the wolf population had met the required criteria, and the expansion of the wolf across much of the state has created a robust wolf population. The eastern quarter of the state is also federally delisted as well. It gives us hope that the rest of our ranchers can gain access to wolf management that includes removal of problem wolves when attacks on livestock become chronic. Ranchers living in the 3/4 of the state west of the arbitrary line of Highway 395, 78, and 95 are living under the wolves being protected under the ESA. They have no way of defending themselves against a wolf attack. Even if a rancher sees a wolf attacking his cattle, he cannot harm the wolf. Wolves kill livestock as a normal action of their lives. They kill to eat, they kill to train their young, and they sport kill. Ranchers many times only find 1 in 8 of the carcasses as identified by the oak leaf study from Idaho. In the process of killing, the wolves traumatize the cattle that are involved in the event. The normal hunting method of a wolf includes running down their prey. Sometimes a cow will not run, but turn and fight to defend their young, or they must fight because their herd is cornered. Either way, as multiple events occur, most if not all of the herd becomes traumatized. The effect of the losses of the producers both increases the producer's direct costs of doing business and reduce the revenue received. The list of the costs include depredations, reduced weaning weights, weight loss of cows, conception rate reductions, and management costs. First 4 are lost income to the producer because of the reduced cattle performance or physical loss of the animals. The last item, management cost, encompasses a large group of issues that cause increased cost of operation. Management issues can be broken down into the cost of implementing non-lethal activities to attempt to mitigate the impact of the wolf's presence, management costs due to the implementation of government regulations and management plans, increased cost of livestock handling, increased costs through injury and death of the livestock, and the loss of range because the wolf's presence in given places makes it unwise to run livestock in that specific area. To put some of the context of these losses for ranchers, taken from a paper I wrote in 2010, for a rancher with 400 head of cattle, the presence of wolves creates a reduced conception rate of about 10%, which costs the rancher $134 a head, reduced weaning weight, $46, depredations $50, reduced cow weight $57, and increased management cost $93, all for a total of $380 per head to each and every cow that's impacted by wolves. To add to this adds up to $152,000 for a 400-head operation. The losses are just not economic. They are also emotional and social management costs related to the expected non-lethal are both time and money. The time issue becomes critical as ranchers work to protect their herds, losing family time and time away from their normal ranching activities. Ranchers feel abandoned when wolves have to be managed under the federal ESA. Wolves cannot be harmed in any way, even though they are tearing their animals apart. To state the obvious, wolves are controversial. Wolf management occurs in 3 arenas: economic, social, and political. Ranchers and hunters are the only ones economically impacted directly by the economic costs. Unfortunately, wolf management and wolf policy is mostly impacted by the social arena, and the decisions are made in the political arena. Ranchers need to be able to have control over their lives and their ranches and their livestock. To accomplish this, we must remove the wolves from the Endangered Species Act. Evidence to support this can be seen in the rapid expansion of wolves into new areas like California and Western Oregon, and increase in numbers of the wolves throughout their occupied range. Wolves don't need the protection of the single species management of the Endangered Species Act. Thank you for the opportunity for ranchers to explain their impacts.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I now recognize Mr. Hamill for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, I'd like to share some thoughts about wolf recovery in Michigan. I'm here today representing 50,000 members of the Safari Club International and Safari Club Foundation, which is a 501c3 organization that annually spends over $4 million to promote science-based wildlife conservation worldwide, including that of threatened and endangered species. By any measure, wolves in the Great Lakes states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan have recovered. Numbers necessary for recovery of gray wolves, as described in both the federal and the state recovery plans, have been met and exceeded in Michigan since 1994. When the Endangered Species Act was signed in 1973, few, if any of us, would have given wolf recovery in this region much of a chance to succeed. However, we were wrong. Due to the legal protections provided by the Endangered Species Act, and most importantly, the will of the people of the Midwest, gray wolves have now occupied most of the range suitable for the species. I'm here to speak about my experience with wolves in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, an area of roughly 16,500 square miles. In the most recent 10 years, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan midwinter wolf population has been documented to be between 620 and 700 animals. Today, as pups are born, that number is probably double. There's probably 1,400 wolves on the landscape of the Upper Peninsula as we sit here today. Michigan wolves' primary diet is white-tailed deer. The study have indicated that deer represent roughly half of their annual food intake. The remainder of their diet is beaver, snowshoe hare, moose, and other small mammals. Wolves are opportunistic predators and normally will consume any food source available to them. In Michigan, as in many other states, wolves exist in the proximity of agriculture. Livestock are often preyed upon. Currently, livestock producers in Michigan are compensated for losses that can be verified. 90 verified cattle depredation events have occurred in the last 10 years. In Michigan, in our state, many of us believe wolves are also responsible for many unverified livestock disappearances. Wolves are territorial predators with packs that vigorously defend a home range, an area that in Michigan is about 80 square miles per family group. Nearly all of Michigan's Upper Peninsula land base is now within the bounds of a defended wolf territory. Our current average pack size is about 5 animals. However, there are packs of wolves in Michigan that number 12, which is very large. A special category of loss that we need to think about is wolf depredation and injuries to pets, particularly dogs. In Michigan, 111 dogs have been verified to have been killed by wolves, and another 49 dogs have been injured by wolves. These numbers should be viewed as minimums, since many dogs in wolf range have disappeared and injuries are often not reported. No owner compensation is offered for loss of dogs. As we all know, these animals are in so many ways family members. When pets are killed by wolves, wolves themselves and the people standing in the way of practical solutions to these depredations quickly gain new enemies from which there is no recovery. The societal culture of the Upper Peninsula values white-tailed deer highly. Our people are second and third generation descendants of Western European and Scandinavian immigrants. Our second homes typically are camps. They're used for outdoor pursuits, but primarily for deer hunting. The plummeting of deer numbers since the mid-1990s has negatively affected this important cultural value in the Upper Peninsula. Most of the blame for deer declines can be explained by habitat deficiencies. However, wolves are being singled out as the factor draining the wolf population. This has led to increasing non-support for wolves and an increase in illegal killing of wolves. Today, 60% of radio-collared wolves in Michigan die at the hands of man. There is an aspect of our current situation that particularly concerns me. Since their reestablishment, wolves have not been subject to any regulated or widespread removals by man. As an apex predator, wolves typically exhibit fearlessness. Wolves have no natural enemies. Nothing kills wolves except man. This has been a period of protection. This has been a period of protection offered by the Endangered Species Act and generally in the absence of human persecution. I believe this has led to an increase in the number of bold wolf incidents. Bold wolf incidents. I repeat that because I think it's very, very important. And that is close encounters between humans and wolves. Nothing good can come of these interactions. Eventually, if a person is injured or worse by wolves, all of the protections and values that wolves currently have will be lost. The success story of recovery may be replaced by old prejudice and a public will to exterminate wolves. Remember, at one time in the past...
Mr. Hamill, I'm going to have to ask you to wind up.
Yes, at one time in the past, wolves were were eradicated on this landscape by far fewer people than live here now. Our wolves in the Midwest are within 1 day's drive, one gas tank full in your car, of 20 million people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamill. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes of questions each. Recognize Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Witnesses, thanks for your testimony. Greatly appreciated. Representative Nelson, I want to begin by thanking you for the tour of your family's farm that you provided for me and my colleagues this morning, and for taking the time to share how the growing wolf population has affected you and your family as farmers and ranchers, in particular your wife's very heartfelt story this morning about the wolves near your children. You and your family have been farming and raising cattle for quite some time now. Can you please talk about how you've dealt with the wolf over time, and were you facing the same challenges today that you were 20 years ago?
Thank you, Congressman Stauber. And with the challenges of the wolves, it really has stayed, it's grown a little bit over the 20 years. The population has continued to increase some, and in as recent estimates of the population by the state of Minnesota and the Fish and Wildlife has really showed a stable population of around 2,700 wolves. That's what the estimate is showing. I do believe that number is probably higher because of the area of that estimate of the wolf population is really takes in, it's not the entire state. And the goal is statewide, however. And, in the recovery effort, the population has grown. So over the last 20, 25 years, we have had more wolf depredation issues. And as one of the other witnesses says, oftentimes, we find 1 out of 7 or 1 out of 8. So there's oftentimes we've got a calf missing, and a cow is looking for a baby, and it's not there.
And just in the interest of time, we were on your farm today, and you had said there was federal trappers just north of your farm. Is that correct? Right now?
Yes, they have been about 6 miles away. There's another ranch that they have been on, and this spring they have, as my knowledge, they've taken 8 wolves off of this ranch. I think there were 2 calves and a cow that were killed there, and this story is basically any direction you go from my farm, you can find a very similar story.
And would you agree that the population has grown more aggressive and more comfortable around cattle and humans?
Yes, I would. I've got stories of, just about 2 years ago, there was a neighbor that was riding her horse through the woods. Something startled the horse. She was bucked off, and the horse ran back to the ranch, and she had to walk out of the woods herself. I believe she was 17 at the time, and there was a wolf trailing her the whole way back. Unfortunately, she was not harmed in that incident. She was a little bit hurt from getting bucked off the wolf, but we're seeing more and more stories. We're hearing more and more of this. Wolves coming right up in through the yards into homes. I've had them come between my barn and my house.
And your wife testified this morning that when your children were younger, the wolf tracks were right up to your back deck. Thank you very much. In my time remaining, Mr. Hamill, can you speak a little bit about how the ESA is supposed to work and what is supposed to happen once a listed species recovers?
Once numerical population goals have been met according to the Endangered Species Act, the animal should qualify for removal from the list. Unfortunately, very few animals are ever removed. The Endangered Species Act is an excellent a vehicle for listing species, but it has serious defects for delisting species. And the holes in that act are often depredated upon by those people who want to keep species in the act.
And my last question, what would you say is the main reason why the ESA isn't being carried out the proper way?
Well, because I think the act itself, the wording of the act itself is is subject to too much interpretation, and that has, of course, been successful at judicial levels to keep animals from being delisted. It's unfortunate.
My last 15 seconds, I've hunted my entire life, 45 minutes north of Duluth. My father's been there. He's 91. Last November was his 60th straight year at the Firearms Deer opener. Tonight and every night we could go to the back deck of the hunting shack and howl, and the wolves would howl back. Just this past week, my brother and my father were heading into the shack road, and just a couple 100 yards away, my 91-year-old father says to my brother, "Jamie, look at the deer." He said, "Dad, that's a wolf." They are around today. There's federal trappers just north of the city of Duluth, and I yield back.
Thank you. Before we go to the next witness, the police have notified us that there are 3 cars blocking their ability to move the police cars, and so to avoid getting towed or worse, whoever has a Toyota RAV4 with the license plate, PAN 296? I don't know that for sure. If you have a Toyota RAV4, go move it. If you have a gray Ram pickup, please move it. If you have a gray 4-door CRV, please move it, or the police will move it for you, and that would be very sad. So let's now move to Ms. Hageman for 5 minutes.
Thank you. We've heard from our Democrat colleagues in Washington that states will hunt wolves to extinction if they are delisted. We know from experience in my home state of Wyoming, however, that that is not the case, as the wolves have been delisted since 2017, and we have maintained and protected a healthy population, while at the same time they are subject to a regulated hunt, and in the vast majority of my state they're actually designated as predators, meaning that they can be shot at any time. Dr. Roberts, given your experience as a wildlife manager, do you believe that states in the Great Lakes region would be just as successful at managing the wolves post-delisting?
Absolutely. I believe they have the competency to be able to manage wolves and to do so in a sustainable way. I think it's likely that they would manage for less wolves, or some states may opt for that, but I am certain that they will be able to manage to retain some wolves on the landscape.
Well, I spent quite a bit of time in preparing for this hearing today, reviewing your Minnesota Wolf Management Plan dated 2023 to 2032, put out by the Department of Natural Resources. And if you go to page 9, it actually states that although this plan was developed in response to federal action, the 2001 plan, which was the predecessor to this, has guided wolf management through multiple ESA listing and delisting decisions. In other words, it's the state of Minnesota that manages wolves right now. And I think a lot of people don't realize is that it is the states that are primarily responsible for managing our wildlife. In reviewing this plan, one of the things that shocked me was that I learned that the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service's recovery goals for the wolf in Minnesota was 1,200 to 1,400 wolves by 2001. But current estimates of the population show that there are more than double that number in the state of Minnesota. And as has been testified to do, today it's probably much higher than that. And that number has stabilized over the last several decades. In other words, the wolf population in Minnesota is stabilized. So as I've read this plan, I think one of the things that struck me, especially in light of the fact that this and its predecessor are how wolves are managed in Minnesota, I kind of see why there's the problem. And I think that the problem stems from the way that wolves are viewed. One of the things that struck me is that there's an awful lot of discussion in this report or this plan about how we're going to incorporate diverse views. We're going to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table. We're going to make sure that we're doing an awful lot of talking. We care a lot about diverse human values, and we talk a lot about diversity in here. But the things that I don't see is there's very little data. There's very little science. There's very little metrics by which we can determine whether wolf management is actually being effective or not. There's almost no discussion whatsoever as to the impact on our other wildlife, on livestock. I turned to page 8 of this report, and it says, this is the vision for wolves, and this is how we're going to determine wolf conservation. It says, They're going to look at the best available ecological, social, and cultural knowledge will inform wolf conservation. I don't know. I'd like science. I'd like data. I'd like to know about resilience. I'd like to know the numbers. I'd like to know the history of wolf recovery and management. I'd like to know how they're balancing the wildlife needs and protecting the prey and making sure that we're also protecting our livestock industry. There's an awful lot of information in here, but there's not a lot of information in here. I wouldn't even call this a wolf management plan. I would call it, we're going to protect wolves at the cost and expense of everything else plan. And everybody in Minnesota is suffering as a result of this. I look, and even when they talk about the attitudes, they will talk about the impact on the hunters and on livestock, but then they really focus on what everybody else wants. And not everybody else are typically the people who are not directly impacted by the decisions that are made. Mr. Nelson, I'd like to go to you. And you've given some good information today about the impact that this has had on you and your other farmers and ranchers. Coming from Wyoming, again, I grew up on a ranch. I know what it's like to want to protect our livestock. I know what it's like pulling a calf at 2 o'clock in the morning and the effort and work that it goes in to put together a breeding program. And what is so frustrating to me is when people say that that's essentially a cost of having this kind of an apex predator in your state. And it really shouldn't be, because part of wildlife management needs to be a balance. We have to balance everything. We know we've got a stable population and we need to move forward with delisting. But can you elaborate on some of the helpful tools that would be available to you if the wolves were delisted in Minnesota?
Thank you for the question. And I think one of the helpful tools, right now, there's nothing we can do unless a wolf is attacking a human. So either myself or my family, or that is the only thing that can happen. And right now, the wolves are getting more and more brazen, and I believe there needs to be a healthy fear. And I think that needs to come both from humans and from wolves. And right now, that doesn't exist. And I think it can be there, and we can maintain populations and maintain goals, and at the same time be able to put a respect on both ways. I don't think there's a respect for from either species for each other right now.
Yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Tiffany for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to congratulate the Vikings on drafting a quarterback here in the last couple weeks. We do that every 15 years over in Wisconsin.
Next.
So very disappointing that Commissioner Strawman is not here today. We see the same thing over in Wisconsin, where the leadership of our wildlife agencies are not showing up for these hearings to listen to the people who truly are sportsmen in our state, in our states. Before I get into the questions at hand here, I do want to ask Dr. Roberts here, you work at a university. We've seen what is going on around the country at various universities that are grabbing headlines these days. What's happening at your university?
Well, thank you for asking, Congressman. Israel is in our minds and in our prayers at College of the Ozarks. We recently hosted a convocation on the plight of Israel for our students and for our community. Our Board of Trustees recently passed unanimously a resolution in support of Israel, and most importantly, calling for a continued prayer for the nation of Israel and her citizens.
Dr. Roberts, isn't it correct that your background, that you've worked for the federal government, is that correct?
Yes, sir, I have.
And is it correct that you worked in Alaska for, was it the Fish and Wildlife Service?
Yes, I worked in Alaska for the National Wildlife Refuge System for the Fish and Wildlife Service.
And Dr. Roberts, haven't you worked in the state of Wisconsin on wildlife issues also?
Yes, I did.
And now you're teaching down at the College of Ozarks, is that accurate?
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the information you gave us in a hearing in regards to you can go up to 29% of take and still not endanger a species. I think that's at the core of what we're discussing here, to make sure that we're making a sound scientific decision in passing a bill like we did this week. Could you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Sure. Most species, there's a surplus that can be taken in a sustainable way. And for wolves, like many other species, we have a good idea of what that is. There are published studies that can help guide that. There are published studies that indicate that somewhere around 30% of the population can be taken in a sustainable way. In other words, you could remove 30% of the population one year and next year have just as many animals.
Also, so I think it was 26 wildlife biologists a decade ago when we had delisting. I was in the state legislature at the time in Wisconsin, and they wrote in their letter, and I don't know if you were a signatory to that letter, but there were 26 wildlife biologists that said, you're going to endanger the Endangered Species Act if you do not allow a delisting to happen when a species should be delisted. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. The Endangered Species Act has the potential to tie the hands of agencies and limit what tools that they can use. And that might be appropriate on a short term to provide some limited protection. But when animals are listed indefinitely, despite ample evidence to suggest that they should not be on the list, I believe that agencies and jurisdictions are going to be very hesitant to want to engage in endangered species management in the future. They don't want another wolf situation. So if there are species that are truly imperiled, I believe that legislatures and agencies are going to be hesitant to do that because they don't want another wolf situation.
And is it the case that we actually have some species that may, numbers may be suffering, that when we're wasting time with, like the Fish and Wildlife Service, on a species that has already, that should be delisted, they could be putting it towards other more worthy efforts. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely. I just saw that the service was spending in excess of, I believe it was $3 million to develop a recovery plan for a species that's recovered. I would argue that money could be better spent on species that need to be recovered, not species that are recovered.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, in closing, I would just say I have the statement of administration policy that the Biden administration put out. We call it the veto message that they put out in regards to this bill. They have backtracked on veto messages in the past over this session of Congress. I would urge you to contact your United States senators here in the Upper Great Lakes here at a critical time in 2024 and make this a prominent issue for all of them. It is us that sets the policy. Let's see if they are willing to stand up for their states, or are they going to stand up for the Biden administration? They have a choice. Do they stand up for Minnesota, for Wisconsin, for Michigan, or do they stand with the Biden administration? They should make that choice this year, and you should help them be able to make that choice. I'm going to close with this. This is intentional in regards to rural America. As my colleague, Representative Hageman, has said a few times on the floor of both committee rooms and the House of Representatives, this is a war on rural America, and you should understand it as such. That is what is going on here. And you need to protect your livelihoods at this point from an administration that is at war with you. I yield back.
So a considerable risk to maintaining control of this hearing. I'm going to recognize Mr. Sauber for 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for your indulgence. Representative Tiffany, in December of 2023, I happened to be in your great state of Wisconsin, and I had the evening off. Could you tell me where in Wisconsin your National Hockey League team is located? I yield back.
Thank goodness. All right. Recognize Ms. Fishbach for 5 minutes.
So how do I follow that? But no, sincerely though, I want to thank the chair for allowing me to participate today because I'm not actually on the committee, so I appreciate being waived on for today. And I do want to thank Representative Stauber and Representative Hageman for your work on this because you are diligently and hard at work in trying to solve this issue because it is a huge issue and Nelson, thank you for the tour this morning. We really appreciate it. And if you wanted to expand, I know that Mr. Stauber had mentioned it, if you want to expand at all about what you said this morning, because it was so meaningful, because, we'd been out in the field and we'd, seen the tracks, and, but I think that what she said, because I feel like the story of the gray wolf is really the story of the failure of the federal government, and who pays the price are the ranchers, the farmers, and the families. And so if you have anything you want to add that she had said this morning, it was pretty incredible.
Well, thank you, Congressman Fischbach. I can't repeat it the same way, then give it the same emphasis that she can. I think only a mother can do that. But as a dad, as a father, it is something that, the concern for our children and family, that's, protecting our children is one of the greatest, our children are the greatest gift we have. And to be able to protect them and raise them in this great nation is a wonderful experience. And, it's an amazing to hear the wolves howl at night. But it's another thing when those same tracks, when you see their tracks, where they were, where they've been, and realize that we're fortunate that we're not a statistic. We continue to hear that, well, there's not been a wolf attack on humans, or if they do, it ends up being a nuance, well, it's only in this situation or that. Why? My wife had asked one of our senators one time when we were out in Washington, D.C. with the Minnesota Farm Bureau, she said, why does my child have to be the first one?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we've never had that situation, but why would we need to be the first one before an action is taken? And this is an opportunity that we can lead on this and be able to take management of it. And I bring back that we can have respect between both species. Wolves can respect humans, humans can respect wolves. That can happen both ways. And I think with a proper plan, that does happen. And I thank you for the question.
Well, and thank you very much. And I will just add what really was meaningful. She talked about, the kids out in the front yard, and you had mentioned that you had tracks just between the house and the bin, and which is not very far, and so there was. All right, thank you very much. But I did want to just ask, and Representative Nelson, we did talk a little bit about compensation this morning, and you also talked about how, Minnesota has moved some of those funds, and they certainly don't have enough in that. So maybe just talking a little bit, because I've heard it from some of the folks in my area about how it's just darn near impossible to even qualify for it because you have to have it. So just maybe a little bit about what the state's doing on there, and what's going on with the money there.
Well, thank you for the question. And the wolf depredation fund and then the elk damage fund, they're separate pots, but they're the same. And up in the northwest corner of the state, there's elk that have they're feeding on the hay bales, they're destroying fences, and there's an effort to rebuild the population, to expand that. And the elk damage is a little easier to see. You can see when they've come into the hay yard and eaten hay. There's evidence left behind that. With the wolves, that's a little bit harder to always quantify when you're missing something. You've got to have proof of that, and that can be a challenge to prove. But at the same time, our funds there usually are not enough. I think right now, wolves, the claims payable in 2024 are $148,000, and I believe there's $175,000 in that account total. We've got a long ways left of 2024.
Yeah, and just how difficult it is to prove that. And I will just say, I really sincerely, I really appreciate the experts, because they know what's going on. They can, but in the end, I'm not an expert, but I don't need to be an expert to know that this has to be dealt with, that we are in real trouble here and we need to deal with this. And so I appreciate everyone being here today, and we will continue the fight, because it really is, it is about making sure that, Mr. Tiffany mentioned rural Minnesota, or rural areas, rural America, but it's about making sure that farmers and ranchers and families can continue to do their work and not be not be afraid every day of the gray wolves. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your indulgence.
I now recognize Ms. Malloy for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me be here and be part of this. I just want to take a second at the beginning to thank everybody who's sitting behind that table for being here. Just very quickly, I used to think Congress was a really distant and unresponsive entity and mostly useless. Now I'm part of it. But the tipping point for me was a field hearing of the House Natural Resources Committee in southern Utah, and I saw them show up and listen to people just like you and me talking about Bureau of Land Management issues in Utah. And I thought, this is how representative government's supposed to work. So I'm really excited that you're all here, that you're participating, that you're seeing your government show up and respond to your needs. And I'm excited to be on this side of the table now, being part of that, because it is what we're supposed to do. I like that everybody keeps talking about the fact that the recovery of the wolf should be celebrated, and I want to take some of my time and just make sure we're all understanding why the recovery of the wolf is not being celebrated. We've talked about the science, we've talked about the politics. I want to make sure we put a nice bow on that for everybody who's here, who was willing to show up and participate and is listening. It's unfortunate, but we've seen time and time again that it's the nature of the federal government not to want to give up control. So when we give the federal government temporary control over something, it never ends up being temporary. And the Endangered Species Act is a really good example of this. We have the numbers. We have experts who've sat here and talked to us about the numbers. We know that the wolf is thriving. You all know that there are wolves here. You live here. You hear them. You've seen the impacts. What we're working on here isn't actually recovery of the species anymore. It's who gets to make the decisions. So the federal government doesn't relinquish control easily. And then even in this case, they've tried several times to relinquish control, and then a group comes in that would be irrelevant if the wolves get delisted, and they sue, and a court says the federal government has to keep managing wolves. So I think everybody here has agreed that we have the numbers. Everyone has agreed that we've met the criteria. The only thing we're still disagreeing about is who gets to make these decisions. And unfortunately, it's a well-established pattern that when the federal government is managing a resource, be it wolves or land or minerals, local voices get drowned out. So one of the reasons it's so important that you're all here today is that local voices are being heard. I think the locals should be helping make these decisions, and that's why having states manage the species is so important. That's why delisting is so important. And so I've taken up most of my own time now, which used to drive me crazy with members of Congress, but I do have some questions. Mr. Nelson, Representative Nelson, I was going to ask you about what your wife said this morning, but now you've been asked that several times. But you've talked about mutual respect between humans and wolves. I think we have the same problem right now between the federal government and the state government. There's just not that level of mutual respect where the federal government is acknowledging that the states can manage these species, and you represent the state. Would you just like to speak to that really quickly?
Well, thank you. And I've long believed that local control is best. And yes, we do need to have a structure and a framework, but I think local control is really the best because it's the people that live and breathe and live in an area that really know what is best. Now, there may be some guidelines they need to follow, but I think whether it's our townships, our counties, our states, I think there's always a tendency for the next level up to be the ones that really want to control and really have the authority. And when really what's happening is the boots on the ground. The control of what is happening to management is largely done through state agencies and local biologists and things like that, while the control of the issue is generally out of D.C. And that's a problem that we see. There can be a high structure, but yet I think much more of the decisions really need to be lower down the ladder.
Thank you. Mr. Williams, you're here from Oregon, very different state, very far away. Are you confident that the state of Oregon could manage wolves in Oregon without the federal government telling them how to do it?
Yes, the eastern quarter is managed by Oregon now, and the wolves are expanding way too fast, and it's completely delisted in our part of the state.
Okay, I'm down to 20 seconds. So Dr. Roberts, Mr. Hamill, just quickly, are you confident that the states could manage this better than the federal government is doing?
Absolutely.
Oh, definitely.
Thank you.
Yes.
I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I thank the witnesses for being here. The question I'm going to ask Representative Nelson first is, it's the label of the hearing, how many wolves is enough, and more to the point, who should decide? And the issue at the ESA level would be the number of wolves necessary to keep wolves going as a species. That'd be a much smaller number than you have here. So you have a much larger, 5,000 wolves. Who's supposed to make the decision about who should have how many wolves? I mean, what is that standard that we're looking for? Now, I heard you on the farm say you're seeking some sort of a balance, that you don't see your deer population plummet, obviously too many wolves. But how one adjusts it and who makes that decision is of great interest to me, to all of us. Is it your thought that this is one of those things where you get around the table with a bunch of folks that think otherwise and sort it out that way, or is there some better way of establishing that standard?
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. And I think really the best way to do when you to make decisions is looking at science. And as Congresswoman Hageman said, in the plan, there really appears to be a lack of science on our decision making, and that's concerning. I am not a problem. I'm a fan of having diversity in our wildlife. It is important, and yet we need to have science. We need to follow the science. How many times have we heard that in the last 4 years, to follow the science? And yet, unfortunately, we are not seeing that in our plans that are coming forward. We're seeing species recover, but yet we're not following the science. And to get it started, we are, but then we're not following through.
Dr. Roberts, once you get to 5,000 wolves, how in the world do you reduce the number? I know there's 60,000 plus wolves in Canada, so they say, and that they're allowed to be hunted in all but 2% of Canada. And yet they're not, at this point, able to slow down the increase in the number of wolves. So if you have 5,000 wolves in this state, what are you going to do? This is not like Eastern Oregon, where I grew up on a ranch, where you could see for miles and, nothing, sagebrush. Here, you see 100 feet. How do you get rid of these wolves? And assuming politically it's acceptable, how do you do it?
Well, reducing a population, I like to imagine landing a plane. You could take a plane from a high altitude and bring it down to land. You could do that very steeply, or you can gradually reduce the population. And the way to do either is going to be through hunting programs, through state management, through hunting programs. So states would use monitoring data. They would set quotas and regulations to achieve those management goals, which would likely be removing a significant number of animals.
Yeah, I hate to keep hopping around, but the time is short. And so, Mr. Williams, there was a suggestion by one of my Democrat colleagues, actually the ranking member on the floor of the House 3 days ago, that a wolf is hardly different than a pet. I actually stood up and said, you obviously don't know the difference between a wolf and a schnauzer. It gave me a chance to use the word schnauzer on the floor of the House. The point, though, is they seem to think that way. That's not true, is it, Mr. Williams? Tell us about, you can avoid too many graphic details, but is a wolf the same when it comes to killing animals as your household pet?
Absolutely not. The wolf is somewhere around 100 pounds. The wolves that we're dealing with, they kill as what they do. They're very good at it. They do not kill their animals and then eat them. They just start eating them, and they keep eating them until they get to something vital, and then the animal dies. It's one of the most horrific deaths you can have. They also pack hunt, or they individually hunt. So if an individual gets beaten by a cow, he'll bring a friend back, and they will win eventually. They also traumatize those animals that they leave alive, the rest of the herd, and the production losses in those kinds of situations, those kinds of families, is extreme. And I could go on, but in no way is a 110-pound wolf that's a born killer anything close to a pet.
Yeah, I think the phrase I was using was natural born killer, and people can make fun of that, but it's the truth. And so we're out of time now, and I want to say to everybody here, thank you so much for being here. And also, I've learned, that, as all of us have up here, that these hearings are only as good as your ability, our ability to get them out to the rest of the nation. So if you want to share what we did today, then go to naturalresources.house.gov, naturalresources.house.gov, look under hearings, and you'll find the video of this hearing. Share it. And so that the type of testimony that we heard today, although it was wonderful for those of us who are present, it would be more wonderful if a couple million people actually heard about it. So please share it. And I want to thank everybody for being here. I thank the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern on Wednesday, May 8th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for those responses. If there's no further business,